Good morning and welcome to Reading Wikis for You, where we read the wiki articles for you. And today we're going to be reading about the M4 Sherman, a U.S. designed tank used by the majority of the Allied powers through World War II. But before we get started, don't forget to drop a comment down below with an article that you'd like to hear about next, and that way I know what you'd like to hear about. So, without any further ado, let's get started. The M4 Sherman, officially Medium Tank M4, was the medium tank most widely used by the United States and Western allies in World War II. The M4 Sherman proved to be reliable, relatively cheap to produce, and available in great numbers. It was also the basis of several other armored fighting vehicles, including self-propelled artillery, tank destroyers, and armored recovery vehicles. Tens of thousands were distributed through the Lend-Lease program to the British Commonwealth, Soviet Union, and other allied nations. The tank was named by the British after the American Civil War General William Tecumseh Sherman. The M4 Sherman tank evolved from the M3 Lee, a medium tank developed by the United States during the early years of World War II. Despite the M3's effectiveness, the tank's unconventional layout and the limitations of its hull-mounted gun prompted the need for a more efficient and versatile design, leading to the development of the M4 Sherman. The M4 Sherman retained much of the mechanical design of the M3, but it addressed several shortcomings and incorporated improvements in mobility, firepower, and ergonomics. One of the most significant changes was the relocation of the main armament, initially a 75mm gun, into a fully traversing turret located at the center of the vehicle. This design allowed for more flexible and accurate fire control, enabling the crew to engage targets with greater precision than was possible on the M3. The development of the M4 Sherman emphasized key factors such as reliability, ease of production, and standardization. The U.S. Army and the designers prioritized durability and maintenance ease, which ensured the tank could be quickly repaired in the field. A critical aspect of the design process was the standardization of parts, allowing for streamlined production and the efficient supply of replacement components. Additionally, the tank's size and weight were kept within moderate limits, which facilitated easier shipping and compatibility with existing logistical and engineering equipment, including bridges and transport vehicles. These design principles were essential for meeting the demands of mass production and quick deployment. The M4 Sherman was designed to be more versatile and easier to produce than previous models, which would prove vital as the United States entered World War II. It became the most produced American tank of the conflict, with a total of 49,324 units built, including various specialized variants. Its production volume surpassed that of any other American tank, and it played a pivotal role in the success of the Allied forces. In terms of tank production, the only World War II-era tank to exceed the M4's production numbers was the Soviet T-34, with approximately 84,070 units built. On the battlefield, the Sherman was particularly effective against German light and medium tanks during the early stages of its deployment in 1942. Its 75mm gun and relatively superior armor provided an edge over the tanks fielded by Nazi Germany during this period. The M4 Sherman saw widespread use across various theaters of combat, including North Africa, Italy, and Western Europe. It was instrumental in the success of several Allied offensives, particularly after 1942, when the Allies began to gain momentum following the Allied landings in North Africa for Operation Torch and the subsequent campaigns in Italy and France. The ability to produce the Sherman in large numbers, combined with its operational flexibility and effectiveness, made it a key component of the Allied war effort. The Sherman's role as the backbone of U.S. armored forces in World War II cemented its legacy as one of the most influential tank designs of the 20th century. Despite its limitations, such as relatively thin armor compared to the German heavy and medium tanks like the Tiger and Panther, the M4 was designed to be both affordable and adaptable. Its widespread deployment, durability, and ease of maintenance ensured it remained in service throughout the war, and it continued to see action even in the years following World War II in various conflicts and regions. The M4 Sherman remains one of the most iconic tanks in military history, symbolizing the industrial might and innovation of the United States during the war. When the M4 tank went into combat in North Africa with the British Army at the Second Battle of El Alamein in late 1942, it increased the advantage of Allied armor over Axis armor and was superior to the lighter German and Italian tank designs. For this reason, the U.S. Army believed that the M4 would be adequate to win the war, and relatively little pressure was initially applied for further tank development. Logistical and transport restrictions, such as limitations imposed by roads, ports, and bridges, also complicated the introduction of a more capable, heavier tank. Tank destroyer battalions, using vehicles built on the M4 hull and chassis, but with open-top turrets and more potent high-velocity guns, also entered widespread use in the Allied armies. Even by 1944, most M4 Shermans kept their dual-purpose 75mm gun. By then, the M4 was inferior in firepower and armor to increasing numbers of German upgraded medium tanks and heavy tanks, but was able to fight on with the help of considerable numerical superiority, greater mechanical reliability, better logistical support, and support from growing numbers of fighter bombers and artillery pieces. Later in the war, a more effective armor-piercing gun, the 76mm gun M1, was incorporated into production vehicles. To increase the effectiveness of the Sherman against enemy tanks, the British refitted some Shermans with a 76.2mm Ordnance QF-17 pounder gun, also known as the Sherman Firefly. The relative ease of production allowed large numbers of the M4 to be manufactured, and significant investment in tank recovery and repair units allowed disabled vehicles to be repaired and returned to service quickly. These factors combined to give the Allies numerical superiority in most battles, and many infantry divisions were provided with M4s and tank destroyers. By 1944, a typical U.S. infantry division had attached for armor support an M4 Sherman battalion, a tank destroyer battalion, or both. After World War II, the Sherman, particularly the many improved and upgraded versions, continued to see combat service in many conflicts around the world, including the UN command forces in the Korean War, with Israel in the Arab-Israeli Wars, briefly with South Vietnam in the Vietnam War, and on both sides of the Indo-Pakistani War of 1965. U.S. prototype. The United States Army Ordnance Department designed the M4 medium tank to replace the M3 medium tank. The M3 was an upgun development of the M2 medium tank of 1939, in turn derived from the M2 light tank of 1935. The M3 was developed as a stopgap measure until a new turret mounting a 75mm gun could be devised. While it was a big improvement when used by the British in Africa against German forces, the placement of a 37mm gun turret on top gave it a very high profile, and the unusual side-sponson-mounted main gun with limited traverse could not be aimed across the other side of the tank. Though reluctant to adopt British weapons into their arsenal, the American designers were ready to accept proven British ideas. These ideas, as embodied in a tank designed by the Canadian General Staff, also influenced the development of the American Sherman tank. Before long, American military agencies and designers had accumulated sufficient experience to forge ahead on several points. In the field of tank armament, the American 75mm and 76mm dual-purpose tank guns won the acknowledgement of British tank experts. Detailed design characteristics for the M4 was submitted by the Ordnance Department on 31 August 1940, but the development of a prototype was delayed while the production of designs of the M3 were finished and the M3 entered full-scale production. On 18 April 1941, the U.S. Armored Force Board chose the simplest of 5 designs, known as the T6. The design was a modified M3 hull and chassis, carrying a newly designed turret mounting the M3 75mm gun. This would later become the Sherman. The Sherman's reliability resulted from features developed for U.S. light tanks during the 1930s, including vertical volute spring suspension, rubber bush tracks, and a rear-mounted radial engine with drive sprockets in front. The goals were to produce a fast, dependable medium tank able to support infantry, provide breakthrough striking capacity, and defeat any existing Axis nation's tank. The T6 prototype was completed on 2 September 1941. The upper hull of the T6 was a single large casting. It featured a single overhead hatch for the driver and a hatch in the side of the hull. In the later M4A1 production model, this large casting was maintained, although the side hatch was eliminated, and a second overhead hatch was added for the assistant driver. The modified T6 was standardized as the M4, and the first production completed in February 1942. The cast hull models would later be restandardized as M4A1, with the first welded hull models receiving the designation M4. In August 1942, a variant of the M4 was put forth by the Detroit Arsenal to have angled rather than rounded hull and turret armor. The changes were intended to improve the tank's protection without increasing weight or degrading other technical characteristics. Doctrine. As the United States approached entry into World War II, armor usage was governed by Field Manual 100-5, Operations, published May 1941, the month after the M4 final design. That manual stated, quote, The Armored Division is organized primarily to perform missions that require great mobility and firepower. It is given decisive missions. It is capable of engaging in all forms of combat, but its primary role is in offensive operations against hostile rear areas." Unquote. The M4 was, therefore, not intended primarily for infantry support. It placed tanks in the striking echelon of the Armored Division and placed the infantry in the support echelon, without directing that tanks should only seek to attack other tanks, thus leaving target selection up to the field commander based on what types of targets were available. A field manual covering the use of the Sherman, FM 17-33, the Tank Battalion, Light and Medium, of September 1942, described fighting enemy tanks, when necessary, as one of the many roles of the Sherman, but devoted only 1 page of text and 4 diagrams to tank versus tank action out of 142 pages. This early armored doctrine was heavily influenced by the sweeping early successes of German blitzkrieg tactics. By the time M4s reached combat in significant numbers, battlefield demands for infantry support and tank versus tank action far outnumbered the occasional opportunities of rear echelon attack. United States doctrine held that the most critical anti-tank work, stopping massed enemy tank attacks, was primarily to be done by towed and self-propelled anti-tank guns operated by tank destroyer battalions, with friendly tanks being used in support if possible. Speed was essential to bring the tank destroyers from the rear to destroy incoming tanks. This doctrine was rarely followed in combat, as it was found to be impractical. Commanders were reluctant to leave tank destroyers in reserve. If they were, it was also easier for an opposing armored force to achieve a breakthrough against an American tank battalion, which would not have all of its anti-tank weapons at the front during the beginning of any attack. U.S. production history. The first production of the Sherman took place at the Lima Locomotive Works and was first used in 1941, with many early vehicles reserved for British use under Lend-Lease. The first production Sherman was given to the U.S. Army for evaluation, and the second tank of the British order went to London. Nicknamed Michael, probably after Michael Dewar, head of the British tank mission in the U.S., the tank was displayed in London and is now an exhibit at the Tank Museum, Bovington, UK. In World War II, the U.S. Army ultimately fielded 16 armored divisions, along with 70 separate tank battalions, while the U.S. Marine Corps fielded 6 tank battalions. A third of all Army tank battalions and all 6 Marine tank battalions were deployed to the Pacific Theater of Operations. Before September 1942, President Franklin D. Roosevelt had announced a production program calling for 120,000 tanks for the Allied war effort. Although the American industrial complex was not affected by enemy aerial bombing or submarine warfare as was Japan, Germany, and to a lesser degree Great Britain, an enormous amount of steel for tank production was diverted to the construction of warships and other naval vessels. Steel used in naval construction amounted to the equivalent of approximately 67,000 tanks, and consequently, only about 53,500 tanks were produced during 1942 and 1943. The Army had 7 main sub-designations for M4 variants during production: M4, M4A1, M4A2, M4A3, M4A4, M4A5, and M4A6. These designations did not necessarily indicate linear improvement, in that M4A4 did not indicate that it was better than M4A3. These subtypes indicated standardized production variations, which were often manufactured concurrently at different locations. The subtypes differed mainly in engines, although the M4A1 differed from the other variants by its fully cast upper hull with a distinctive rounded appearance. The M4A4 had a longer engine that required a longer hull and more track blocks, and thus the most distinguishing feature of the M4A4 was the wider longitudinal spacing between the bogies. M4A5 was an administrative placeholder designation for the Canadian Ram tank. The M4A6 had a radial diesel engine as well as the elongated chassis of the M4A4, but only 75 of these were ever produced. Most Sherman subtypes ran on gasoline. The air-cooled Continental-produced Wright R975 Whirlwind 9-cylinder radial gasoline engine in the M4 and M4A1 produced 350 or 400 horsepower. The M4A3 used the liquid-cooled 450 horsepower Ford GAA V8 gasoline engine, and the M4A4 used the liquid-cooled 370 horsepower 30-cylinder Chrysler A57 multi-bank gasoline engine. There were also 2 diesel engine variants. The M4A2 was powered by a pair of liquid-cooled GMC Detroit diesel 671 two-stroke inline engines. That produced a total of 375 horsepower, while the M4A6 used an RD1820, a redesigned Caterpillar D200A air-cooled radial diesel engine, adapted from Wright Aeronautical's Wright R1820 Cyclone 9 9-cylinder radial aircraft engine, that produced 450 horsepower. A 24-volt electrical system was used in the M4. The M4A2 and M4A4 were mostly supplied to other Allied countries under Lend-Lease. The term M4 can refer specifically to the initial subtype with its Continental radial engine, or generically to the entire family of 7 Sherman subtypes, depending on context. Many details of production, shape, strength, and performance improved while in production, without a change to the tank's basic model number. These included stronger suspension units, safer wet ammunition storage, and stronger or more effective armor arrangements, such as the M4 Composite, which had a cheaper-to-produce cast front hull section mated to a regular welded rear hull. British nomenclature for Shermans was by mark numbers for the different hulls, with letters for differences in armament and suspension. A for a vehicle with a 76mm gun, B for the 105mm howitzer, C for the 17-pounder gun, and Y for any vehicle equipped with horizontal volute spring suspension, or HVSS. Example, the British-operated M4A176 was known as the Sherman 2A. M4 Sherman comparison of key product features of selected models. All right. So, designation, then main armament, then hull, and then the engine type. So, M4, 75mm main gun, welded hull, gasoline Continental R975 radial engine. M4 105, main armament, 105mm howitzer, welded hull, gasoline Continental R975 radial engine. M4 Composite, 75mm main gun, cast front welded sides hull, gasoline Continental R975 radial engine. M4A1, 75mm main gun, cast hull, gasoline Continental R975 radial engine. M4A1 76W, 76mm main gun, cast hull, gasoline Continental R975 radial engine. M4A2, 75mm main gun, welded hull, GM 6046 diesel engine. M4A2 76W, 76mm main gun, welded hull, GM 6046 diesel engine. M4A3 75W, 75mm main gun, welded hull, gasoline Ford GAA V8 engine. M4A3E2 Jumbo, 75mm main gun, some 76mm main gun, welded hull, gasoline Ford GAA V8 engine. M4A3 76W, 76mm main gun, welded hull, gasoline Ford GAA V8 engine. M4A4, 75mm welded and lengthened hull, gasoline Chrysler Ace 57 multi-bank engine. M4A6, 75mm main gun, cast front, welded sides, lengthened, diesel Caterpillar D200A radial engine. Early Shermans mounted a 75mm medium-velocity general-purpose gun. Although ordnance began work on the T-20, 22, 23 series as Sherman replacements, the Army ground forces were satisfied with the M4, and Armored Force Board considered some features of the experimental tanks unsatisfactory. Continuing with M4 minimized production disruption, but elements of the experimental designs were incorporated into the Sherman. Later, M4A1, M4A2, and M4A3 models received the larger turret with high-velocity 76mm gun trialed on the T-23 tank. The first standard production 76mm gun-armed Sherman was an M4A1, accepted in January 1944, which first saw combat in July 1944 during Operation Cobra. Variants of the M4 and M4A3 were factory-produced with a 105mm howitzer and a distinct rounded gun manlet, which surrounded the main gun on the turret. The first Sherman variant to be armed with a 105mm howitzer was the M4, first accepted in February 1944. From May to July 1944, the Army accepted a limited run of 254 M4A3E2 jumbo Shermans, which had very thick hull armor and the 75mm gun in a new, better protected T-23 style turret. Jumbos could mount the 76mm M1 cannon. To assault fortifications, leading convoys, and spearhead armored columns. The M4A3 model was the first to be factory produced with the HVSS system with wider tracks to distribute weight, beginning in August 1944. With a smooth ride of HVSS, it gained the nickname Easy 8 from its experimental E8 designation. The M4 and M4A3 105mm armored tanks, as well as the M4A1 and M4A2 76mm armed tanks, were also eventually equipped with HVSS. Both the Americans and British developed a wide array of special attachments for the Sherman, although few saw combat, remaining experimental. Those that saw action included a bulldozer blade, the duplex drive system, flamethrowers for Zippo flame tanks, and various rocket launchers such as the T-34 Calliope. British variants, DDs, and mine flails formed part of the group of specialized vehicles collectively known as Hobart's Funnies, after Percy Hobart, commander of the 79th Armored Division. The M4 Sherman's basic chassis was used for all the sundry roles of the mechanized force. These included the M10 and M36 tank destroyers, M7B1, M12, M40, and M43 self-propelled artillery, the M32 and M74 tow truck-style recovery tanks with winches, booms, and an 81mm mortar for smoke screens, and the M34 from M32B1 and M35 from M10A1 artillery prime movers. M4 Sherman production. The M4, manufactured by Press Steel Car Company, Baldwin Locomotive Works, American Locomotive Company, Pullman Standard Car Company, and Detroit Tank Arsenal, total of 6,748 produced from July 1942 to January 1944. The M4-105, produced by the Detroit Tank Arsenal, 800 in total, from February 1944 to September 1944. M4-105 HVSS, the Detroit Tank Arsenal, 841, September 1944 to March 1945. M4A1, produced by the Lima Locomotive Works, Press Steel Car Company, Pacific Car and Foundry Company, 6,281 from February 1942 to December 1943. M4A1 76W, Press Steel Car Company, 2,171 units made from January 1944 to December 1944. M4A1 76W HVSS, Press Steel Car Company, 1,255 units, January 1945 to July 1945. M4A2, Fisher Tank Arsenal Grand Blanc, Pullman Standard Car Company, American Locomotive Company, Baldwin Locomotive Works, Federal Machine and Welder Company, 8,053 units, from April 1942 to May 1944. M4A2 76W, Fisher Tank Arsenal, 1,594 units made, May 1944 to December 1944. M4A2 76W HVSS, made by the Fisher Tank Arsenal and Press Steel Car Company, 1,321 units made, January 1945 to May 1945. M4A3, Ford Motor Company, 1,690 units, June 1942 to September 1943. M4A3 75W, Fisher Tank Arsenal, 2,420 units made, February 1944 to December 1944. M4A3 75W HVSS, Fisher Tank Arsenal, 651 units made, January 1945 to March 1945. M4A3E2, Fisher Tank Arsenal, 254 units made, May 1944 to July 1944. M4A3 76W, Detroit Tank Arsenal, Fisher Tank Arsenal, 1,400 units made by Detroit, 500 units made by Fisher Tank Arsenal, total of 1,925, made from February to July 1944 and July 1944 to December 1944. M4A3 76W HVSS, Detroit Tank Arsenal, 2,617 from July 1944 to April 1945. M4A3 105, Detroit Tank Arsenal, 500 units, May 1944 to September 1944. M4A3 105 HVSS, Detroit Tank Arsenal, 2,539 units, September 1944 to June 1945. M4A4, Detroit Tank Arsenal, 7,499 units, July 1942 to November 1943. M4A6, Detroit Tank Arsenal, 75 units, October 1943 to February 1944. Service history. Allocation. During World War II, approximately 19,247 Shermans were issued to the U.S. Army and about 1,114 to the U.S. Marine Corps. The U.S. also supplied 17,184 to the United Kingdom, some of which in turn went to the Canadians and the Free Poles, while the Soviet Union received 4,102 and an estimated 812 were transferred to China. These numbers were distributed further to the respective countries' allied nations. The U.S. Marine Corps used the diesel M4A2 and gasoline-powered M4A3 in the Pacific. However, the chief of the Army's Armored Force, Lieutenant General Jacob L. Devers, ordered that no diesel-engine Shermans be used by the Army outside the zone of the interior, the continental U.S. The Army used all types for either training or testing within the United States, but intended the M4A2 and M4A4 with the A57 multi-bank engine to be the primary Lend-Lease exports. First combat. Shermans were being issued in small numbers for familiarization to U.S. armored divisions when there was a turn of events in the Western Desert Campaign. On 21 June 1942, Axis forces captured Tobruk, threatening Egypt and Britain's supply line through the Suez Canal. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill was at the Second Washington Conference when news of the defeat broke. President Franklin D. Roosevelt asked what he could do to help, and Churchill replied at once, "Give us as many Sherman tanks as you can spare and ship them to the Middle East as quickly as possible." The U.S. considered collecting all Shermans together to be able to send the 2nd Armored Division under Patton to reinforce Egypt, but delivering the Shermans directly to the British was quicker, and over 300, mostly M4A1s, but also including M4A2s, had arrived there by September 1942. The Shermans were modified for desert warfare with shields over the tracks and another stowage. The Sherman first saw combat at the Second Battle of El Alamein in October 1942 with the British 8th Army. At the start of the offensive, there were 252 tanks fit for action. These equipped the British 9th Armored Brigade for the battle under the New Zealand Division, 2nd Armored Brigade, 1st Armored Division, and 8th and 20th Armored Brigades, 10th Armored Division. Their first encounter with tanks was against German Panzer III and IV tanks with long 50mm and 75mm guns, engaging them at 2,000 yards. There were losses to both sides. The first U.S. Shermans in battle were M4s and M4A1s in Operation Torch the following month. On 6 December, near Tibourba, Tunisia, a platoon from the 2nd Battalion, 13th Armored Regiment was lost to enemy tanks and anti-tank guns. Additional M4s and M4A1s replaced M3s in the U.S. tank battalions over the course of the North African campaign. The M4 and M4A1 were the main types in U.S. units until the fall of 1944, when the Army began replacing them with the preferred M4A3 with its more powerful 500 horsepower engine. Some M4s and M4A1s continued in U.S. service for the rest of the war. The first Sherman to enter combat with a 76mm gun in July 1944 was the M4A1, then the M4A2, closely followed by the M4A3. By the end of the war, roughly half of the U.S. Army Shermans in Europe had the 76mm gun. The first HVSS-equipped Sherman to see combat was the M4A376W in December 1944. Eastern Front. Under Lend-Lease, 4,102 M4A2 medium tanks were sent to the Soviet Union. Of these, 2,007 were equipped with the original 75mm main gun, with 2,095 mounting the more capable 76mm gun. The total number of Sherman tanks sent to the USSR under the Lend-Lease represented 18.6% of all Lend-Lease Shermans. The first 76mm armed M4A2 Shermans started to arrive in the Soviet Union in the late summer of 1944. The Soviet records reported the receiving of 3,664 tanks, the difference mainly due to deliveries being sunk on the way and discrepancies between the United States and Soviet Union archives. The Red Army considered the M4A2 to be much less prone to catch fire due to ammunition detonation than the T-34-76, but the M4A2 had a higher tendency to overturn in road accidents and collisions or because of rough terrain than the T-34 due to its higher center of gravity. By 1945, some Red Army armored units were equipped entirely with the Sherman. Such units included the 1st Guards Mechanized Corps, the 3rd Guards Mechanized Corps, the 9th Guards Mechanized Corps, amongst others. According to Soviet tanker Dmitry Loza, the Sherman was held in good regard and viewed positively by many Soviet tank crews, with compliments given to its reliability, ease of maintenance, generally good firepower, referring especially to the 76mm gun version, as well as an auxiliary power unit to keep the tank's batteries charged without having to run the main engine, as was required on the T-34. However, according to Soviet tank crews, the Sherman also had disadvantages, the greatest being its high center of gravity and the ease of hitting it by enemy fire. The Sherman's relatively narrow set of tracks struggled to negotiate muddy terrain compared to the wider set tracks of the T-34 or German Panther tank. David M. Glantz wrote, quote, "The Sherman's narrow treads made it much less mobile on mud than its German and Soviet counterparts, and it consumed great quantities of fuel," unquote. Glantz noted that Soviet tankers preferred the American tanks to the British ones, but preferred Soviet ones most of all. Pacific Theater. While combat in the European theater often consisted of high-profile armored warfare, the mainly naval nature of the Pacific theater of operations relegated it to secondary status for both Allies and the Japanese. While the U.S. Army fielded 16 armored divisions and 70 separate tank battalions during the war, only a third of the battalions and none of the divisions were deployed to the Pacific theater. The Imperial Japanese Army deployed only their 1st Tank Division and 2nd Tank Division to the Pacific during the war, with the 3rd Tank Division being deployed in Burma, China, and Manchukuo's border with the Soviet Union, and the 4th Tank Division remaining on the Japanese home islands in preparation for an Allied invasion that never came. Armor from both sides mostly operated in jungle terrain that was poorly suited to armored warfare. For this type of terrain, the Japanese and the Allies found light tanks easier to transport and deploy. During the early stages of combat in the Pacific, specifically the Guadalcanal campaign, the U.S. Marine Corps M2A4 light tank fought against the equally matched Type 95 Ha-Go light tank. Both were armed with a 37mm main gun. However, the M2, produced in 1940, was newer by 5 years. By 1943, the IJA still used the Type 95 and Type 97 Chi-Ha medium tanks, while Allied forces were quickly replacing their light tanks with 75mm armed M4s. The Chinese in India received 100 M4 Shermans and used them to great effect in the subsequent 1944 and 1945 offensives in the China-Burma-India theater. To counter the Sherman, the Japanese developed the Type 3 Chi-Nu and the heavier Type 4 Chi-To. Both tanks were armed with 75mm guns, albeit of different type. Only 166 Type 3s and 2 Type 4s were built, and none saw combat. They were saved for the defense of the Japanese home islands, leaving 1930s-era light and medium armor to do battle against 1940s-built Allied light and medium armor. During the later years of the war, general-purpose high-explosive ammunition was preferred for fighting Japanese tanks because armored piercing rounds, which had been designed for penetrating thicker steel, often went through the thin armor of the Type 95 Ha-Go and out the other side without stopping. Although the high-velocity guns of tank destroyers were useful for penetrating fortifications, M4s armed with flamethrowers were often deployed, as direct fire seldom destroyed Japanese fortifications. Korean War. During the Korean War, the M4A3E8 EZ-8 was the main tank force of the U.S. military until the signing of the Armistice Agreement. At the outbreak of the war, the U.S. military tried to deploy the M4A3E8, a medium-sized tank of the same class, to respond to the North Korean T-34-85, but there were few tanks available for rapid deployment from the Far East due to disarmament after World War II. The U.S. Far East Command collected 58 M4A3E8 scattered throughout Japan, created the 8072nd Temporary Tank Battalion, later renamed the 89th Tank Battalion, on 17 July and landed them in Busan on 1 August. The 8072nd Temporary Tank Battalion was immediately deployed for the Battle of Masan to support the 25th U.S. Infantry Division. Since then, a total of 679 M4A3E8 were deployed on the Korean Peninsula in 1950. The M4A3E8 and T-34-85 were comparable and could destroy each other at normal combat ranges, although the use of high-velocity armor-piercing ammunition, advanced optics, and better crew training gave the Sherman an advantage. The M4A3E8, using 76mm HVAP ammunition, destroyed 41 enemy tanks from July to November 1950. The M4A3E8 had weaker anti-tank combat capability compared to the larger caliber M26 Pershing and the M46 Patton that were operated at the same time. However, the lighter M4A3E8 became the preferred U.S. tank in the later phases of the war. It was considered more advantageous in terms of maneuverability on rough terrain and ease of maintenance due to the mechanical reliability. Because of this feature, the M4A3E8 were widely used for providing close support to infantry units, particularly during battles for high ground and mountains. From December 1951, around 20 M4A3E8 saw service with the Republic of Korea Marine Corps during the war, while the Army operated M36 GMCs as its main armored asset. Other uses. After World War II, the U.S. kept the M4A3E8 EZ8 in service with either the 76mm gun or a 105mm M4 howitzer. The U.S. Army replaced the M4 in 1957 in favor of the M47 Patton, M48 Patton, and M60 Patton. The U.S. continued to transfer Shermans to its allies, which contributed to widespread foreign use. The Israeli Defense Force used Shermans from its creation in 1948 until the 1980s, having first acquired a single M4A2 lacking the main armament from British forces as they withdrew from Israel. The popularity of the tank, having now been rearmed, compared to the outdated 1934 origin French Renault R35 interwar light tanks with their 37mm short-barreled guns, which made up the bulk of the IDF's tank force, led to the purchase of 30 unarmed M4 105mm from Italian scrapyards. 3 of these, plus the original M4A2, saw extensive service in the 1948-49 War of Independence. The remainder were then serviced and rearmed with 75mm guns and components whenever these became available, composing a large part of Israeli tank forces for the next 8 years. The 75mm armed Shermans were replaced by M4A1 76mm Shermans, imported from France before the 1956 Suez Crisis, after it was realized that their armor penetration was insufficient for combat against newer tanks such as the IDF Centurions, as well as the T-34-85s being delivered to Egyptian forces. During further upgrades, the French military helped develop a conversion kit to upgrade about 300 Shermans to the long, high-velocity 75mm gun CN-7550 used in the AMX-13. These were designated Sherman M50 by the Israelis. Before the Six-Day War in 1967, the Israeli army upgraded about 180 M4A1 76W HVSS Shermans with the French 105mm Model F1 gun, re-engined them with Cummins diesel engines, and designated the upgraded tank the Sherman M51. The Sherman tanks, fighting alongside the 105mm Centurion shot call and M48 Patton tanks, were able to defeat the T-34-85, T-54-55-62 series, and IS-3 tanks used by the Egyptian and Syrian forces in the 1967 Six-Day War. M4A3s were also used by British forces in Indonesia during the Indonesian National Revolution until 1946, when they were passed on to the KNIL, which used them until 1949 before they were passed on to the Indonesian National Armed Forces. Armament. Gun development. As the Sherman was being designed, provisions were made so that multiple types of main armament, specified as a 75mm gun, a 3-inch gun, or 105mm howitzer, could be mounted in the turret. The possibility of mounting the main gun of the M6 heavy tank, the 3-inch gun M7, in the turret of the M4 Sherman was explored first, but its size and weight, the weapon was modified from a land-based anti-aircraft gun, made it too large to fit in the turret of the Sherman. Development on a new 76mm gun better suited to the Sherman began in fall 1942. In early 1942, tests began on the feasibility of mounting a 105mm howitzer in the turret of the Sherman. The basic 105mm howitzer M2A1 was found to be ill-designed for mounting in a tank turret, so it was completely redesigned and redesignated the 105mm howitzer M4. After modifications of the current turret concerning the balancing of the gun and the strength of the power traverse, and interior of the hull concerning the stowage of the 105mm ammunition, the Ordnance Department expressed its approval of the project, and production of M4 tanks armed with 105mm howitzers began in February 1944. The Sherman would enter combat in 1942 equipped with the 75mm gun M3, a 40 caliber gun that could penetrate an estimated 88mm of rolled homogeneous armor at 90 degrees, a range of 100 meters, and 73mm at 1,000 meters, firing the usual M61 APCBC round, and equipped with an M38A2 telescopic gun sight. Facing the early Panzer III and Panzer IV in North Africa, the Sherman's gun could penetrate the frontal armor of these tanks at normal combat ranges. Within 1,000 yards, the U.S. Army intelligence discounted the arrival of the Tiger I in 1942 and the Panther tank in 1943, predicting that the Panther would be a heavy tank like the Tiger I, and doubted that many would be produced. There were also reports of British QF 6-pounder 57mm guns being able to destroy the Tiger I, However, this only happened at very close ranges and against the thinner side armor. Due to their misconceptions related to this, and also due to tests that seemed to prove that the 76mm gun was able to destroy both the Tiger and the Panther, the leadership of Army ground forces were not especially concerned by the Tiger I. The criteria and results of the 76mm gun test were later ruled to have been inaccurate when compared to real-world conditions. Tests against sections of American armor plate configured to resemble those found on a Panther tank suggested that the new M4A1 gun would be adequate, but testing against actually captured Panther tanks was never done, with Eisenhower even remarking that he was wrongly told by ordnance that the 76mm could knock out any German tank. The Army also failed to anticipate that the Germans would attempt to make the Panther the standard tank of their panzer divisions in 1944, supported by small numbers of Tiger Is and IIs. When the newly designed 76mm gun, known as the T1, was first installed in the M4 in spring 1943, it was found to unbalance the turret, and the gun barrel also protruded too far forward, making it more difficult to transport and susceptible to hitting the ground when the tank traveled over undulating terrain. The barrel length was reduced by 15 inches, resulting in the M1 variant. Mounting this gun in the original M4 turret proved problematic, so the turret for the aborted T-23 tank project was used instead for the definitive production version of the 76mm M4 Shermans, along with a modified version of the gun known as the M1A1. Despite the Ordnance Department's development of a new 76mm and 90mm anti-tank guns, the Army ground forces rejected their deployment as unnecessary. An attempt to upgrade the M4 Sherman by installing the 90mm armed turret from the T-26 tank project on an M4 hull in April 1944 was halted after realizing it could not go into production sooner than the T-26 and would likely delay T-26 development. Even in 1943, most German armored fighting vehicles, later models of the Panzer IV tank, Stug 3 assault gun, and Marder 3 Panzerjäger self-propelled anti-tank gun, mounted the 7.5cm KWK-40. As a result, even weakly armored light German tank destroyers such as the Marder 3, which was meant to be a stopgap measure to fight Soviet tanks in 1942, could destroy Shermans from a distance. The disparity in firepower between the German armored fighting vehicles that began to be fielded in 1943 and the 75mm armed M4 was the impetus to begin production of 76mm armed M4s in January 1944. In testing before the invasion of Normandy, the 76mm gun was found to have an undesirably large muzzle blast that kicked up dust from the ground and obscured vision for further firing. The M1A1C gun, which entered production lines in March 1944, was threaded for a muzzle brake, but as the brakes were still in development, the threads were protected with a cap. The addition of a muzzle brake on the new M1A2 gun, which also incorporated a faster rifling twist leading to a slight accuracy increase at longer ranges, beginning in October 1944, finally solved this problem by directing the blast sideways. Army doctrine at the time emphasized the multi-role ability of the tank, and the capability of the high-explosive shell was considered important. Being a dedicated anti-tank gun, the 76mm had a much weaker high-explosive shell than the existing 75mm, and was not initially accepted by various U.S. Armored Division commanders, even though many had already been produced and were available. All of the U.S. Army M4s deployed initially in Normandy in June 1944 had the 75mm gun. Fighting against Panther tanks in Normandy quickly demonstrated the need for better anti-tank firepower, and the 76mm M4s were deployed to 1st Army units in July 1944. Operation Cobra was the combat debut of the 76mm gun-armed Sherman in the form of the M4A1 76W. General George S. Patton's 3rd Army were initially issued 75mm M4s and accepted 76mm armed M4s only after the Battle of Aricourt against Panther tanks in late September 1944. The higher velocity 76mm gun gave Sherman's anti-tank firepower equal to many of the German vehicles they encountered, particularly the Panzer IV and the Stug 3, but its gun was inferior to that of the Tiger or the Panther. The 76mm could penetrate 125mm of unsloped RHA at 100 meters and 106mm at 1,000 meters, using the usual M62 round. The M1 helped to equalize the Sherman and the Panzer IV in terms of firepower. The .48 caliber 7.5cm KWK-40, of the Panzer IV could penetrate 135 millimeters unsloped RHA at 100 meters and 109 millimeters at 1,000 meters. The 76 millimeter gun was still inferior to the much more powerful 70 caliber 7.5 centimeter KWK-42 of the Panther, which could penetrate 185 millimeters of unsloped RHA at 100 meters and 149 millimeters at 1,000 meters, using the usual PZGR .39/42 round. The 76 millimeter was capable of knocking out a Panther at normal combat ranges from the flanks or rear, but could not overcome the glacis plate. Due to its 55-degree slope, the Panther's 80 millimeter glacis had a line of sight thickness of 140 millimeters, with actual effectiveness being even greater. An M4 might only knock out a Panther frontally from point-blank range by aiming for its turret front and traverse cylindrical-shaped mantlet, the lower edge of which on most Panthers, especially the early Ausf D and A versions, constituted a vulnerable shot trap. A 76mm armed Sherman could penetrate the upper frontal hull superstructure of a Tiger I tank from normal combat ranges. Although the new gun lessened the gap between the two tanks, the Tiger I was still capable of knocking an M4 out frontally from over 2,000 meters. In late summer 1944, after breaking out of the bocage and moving into open country, U.S. tank units that engaged German defensive positions at longer ranges sometimes took 50% casualties before spotting where the fire was coming from. The average combat range noted by the Americans for tank versus tank action was 800 to 900 meters. Sherman crews also had concerns about firing from longer ranges, as Sherman's high flash powder made their shots easier to spot. This, in the U.S. Army's usual offensive tactical situation, often contributed to losses suffered by the U.S. Army in Europe. Even though the various gun sights fitted to the Sherman had fewer magnification settings than those fitted to German tanks, their gunners were able to use a secondary periscope that featured a far larger field of view than their German counterparts. T4 high-velocity armor-piercing HVAP ammunition became available in September 1944 for the 76mm gun. The projectile contained a tungsten penetrator surrounded by a lightweight aluminum body and ballistic windshield, which gave it a higher velocity and more penetrating power. The increased penetration of HVAP allowed the 76mm gun to match the Panther's 7.5 cm KWK-42 APCR shot. However, its performance was heavily degraded by sloped armor such as the Panther's glacis. Because of tungsten shortages, HVAP rounds were constantly in short supply. Priority was given to U.S. tank destroyer units, and over half of the 18,000 projectiles received were not compatible with the 76mm gun M1, being fitted into the cartridge case of the M10 tank destroyer's 3-inch gun M7. Most Shermans carried only a few rounds at any one time, and some units never received any. The British anticipated future developments in German armor and began development of a 3-inch anti-tank gun even before its 57mm predecessor entered service. Out of expediency, and also driven by delays in their new tank designs, they mounted the powerful 76.2mm Ordnance QF 17-pounder gun in a standard 75mm M4 Sherman turret. This conversion became the Sherman Firefly. The US M1 gun and the 17-pounder had nearly identical bore diameters, but the British piece used a more voluminous cartridge case containing a much bigger propellant charge. This allowed it to penetrate 174 millimeters of unsloped RHA at 100 meters and 150 millimeters at 1,000 meters, using APCBC ammunition. The 17-pounder still could not penetrate the steeply sloped glacis plate of the Panther, but it was expected to be able to pierce its gun mantlet at over 2,500 yards. Moreover, it was estimated that it would defeat the Tiger I's frontal armor from 1,900 yards. However, British Army test results conducted with 2 Fireflies against a Panther turret-sized target demonstrated relatively poor accuracy at long range, a hit probability of 25.4% at 1,500 yards with APCBC, and only 7.4% with APDS. In late 1943, the British offered the 17-pounder to the U.S. Army for use in their M4 tanks. General Devers insisted on comparison tests between the 17-pounder and the U.S. 90mm gun. The tests were finally done on 25 March to 23 May 1944. They seemed to show the 90mm gun was equal to or better than the 17-pounder. By then, production of the 76mm armed M4 and the 90mm armed M36 were both underway, and U.S. Army interest in the 17-pounder waned. Late in 1944, the British began to produce tungsten sabot rounds for the 17-pounder, which could readily breach the armor of even the Tiger II. These were not as accurate as standard rounds and not generally available. After the heavy tank losses of the Battle of the Bulge in January 1945, General Eisenhower asked that no more 75mm M4s be sent to Europe. Only 76mm M4s were wanted. Interest in mounting the British 17-pounder in the U.S. Shermans flared anew. In February 1945, the U.S. Army began sending 75mm M4s to England for conversion to the 17-pounder. Approximately 100 conversions were completed by the beginning of May. By then, the end of the war in Europe was clearly in sight, and the U.S. Army decided the logistical difficulties of adding new ammunition caliber to the supply system was not warranted. None of the converted 17-pounder M4s was deployed in combat by the U.S., and it is unclear what happened to most of them, although some were given to the British as part of the Lend-Lease post-war. The Tank Destroyer Doctrine. General Leslie J. McNair was head of the Army Ground Forces from 1942 to 1944. McNair, a former artilleryman, advocated for the role of the tank destroyer within the U.S. Army. In McNair's opinion, tanks were to exploit breakthroughs and support infantry, while masses of attacking hostile tanks were to be engaged by tank destroyer units, which were composed of a mix of self-propelled and towed anti-tank guns. Self-propelled tank destroyers, called gun motor carriages, as were any U.S. Army self-propelled armored vehicles mounting an artillery piece of heavy caliber, were similar to tanks but were lightly armored with open-top turrets. The tank destroyers were supposed to be faster and carry a more powerful anti-tank gun than tanks, although in reality tanks often received more powerful guns before tank destroyers did. And armor was sacrificed for speed. Armored force and tank destroyer force doctrine were developed separately, and it was not against armored force doctrine for friendly tanks to engage hostile tanks that appeared while attacking or defending. Tank destroyers were to engage numbers of enemy tanks that broke through friendly lines. McNair approved the 76mm upgrade of the M4 Sherman and production of the 90mm gun-armed M36 tank destroyer, but he at first staunchly opposed mass production of the T-20 medium tank series and its descendants, the T-25 and T-26, which would eventually become the M26 Pershing. During the crucial period of 1943, because they did not meet the two criteria of the Army Ground Forces for accepting new equipment. They were not battle-worthy, and he saw no battle need for them. In fall 1943, Lieutenant General Devers, commander of U.S. forces in the European Theater of Operations, asked for 250 T-26 tanks for use in the invasion of France. McNair refused, citing the fact that he believed the M4 was adequate. Devers appealed all the way to the War Department, and Major General Russell L. Maxwell, the Assistant Chief of Staff G4 of the War Department General Staff, ordered the 250 tanks built in December 1943. McNair finally relented in his opposition, but still opposed mass production. His Army ground forces even asked for the tanks to be downgunned, from 90mm to 75 or 76mm in April 1944, believing the 76mm gun was capable of performing satisfactorily. General George C. Marshall then summarily ordered the tanks to be provided to the ETO as soon as possible. Soon after the Normandy invasion in June 1944, General Dwight D. Eisenhower urgently requested heavy tanks, but McNair's continued opposition to mass production due to persistent serious mechanical problems with the vehicles delayed their procurement. That same month, the War Department reversed course and completely overruled the Army ground forces when making their tank production plan for 1945. 7,800 tanks were to be built, of which 2,060 were to be T-26s armed with 90mm guns, 2,728 were to be T-26s armed with 105mm howitzers, and 3,000 were to be M4A3 Sherman tanks armed with 105mm howitzers. As a part of the plan, the British requested 750 90mm armed T-26s and 200 105mm armed T-26s. General McNair was killed in a botched air support mission in July 1944, and the path of production for the T-26 tank became somewhat clearer. General Marshall intervened again, and the tanks were eventually brought into full production. However, only a few T-26 tanks, by then designated M26, saw combat beginning in February 1945, too late to have any effect on the battlefield. Variants. The Sherman, like its M3 predecessor, was one of the first tanks to feature a gyroscopically stabilized gun in sight. The stabilization was only in the vertical plane. The mechanism could not slew the turret. The stabilizer was sufficient to keep the gun's elevation setting within 1/8 of a degree, or 2 mils, while crossing moderately rough terrain at 15 miles an hour. This gave a hit probability of 70% on enemy tanks at ranges of 300 yards to 1,200 yards. The utility of stabilization is debatable, with some saying it was useful for its intended purposes, others that it was useful only for using the sights for stabilized viewing on the move. Some operators disabled the stabilizer. The 75mm gun also had an effective canister round that functioned as a large shotgun. In the close fighting of the French bocage of Normandy, the U.S. Army's 2nd Armored Division tanks used Cullen hedgerow cutters, fitted their tanks to push 3 tanks together through a hedgerow. The flank tanks would clear the back of the hedgerow on their side with canister rounds, while the center tank would engage and suppress known or suspected enemy positions on the next hedgerow. This approach permitted surprisingly fast progress through the very tough and well-defended hedgerows in Normandy. Over 500 sets of these were fitted to U.S. armored vehicles, and many fitted to various British tanks, where they were called prongs. The 75mm gun had a white phosphorus shell originally intended for use as an artillery marker to help with targeting. M4 tank crews discovered that the shell could also be used against the Tiger and Panther. When the burning white phosphorus adhered to the German tanks, their excellent optics would be blinded and the acrid smoke would be sucked inside the vehicle, making it difficult or impossible for the crew to breathe. This and the fear of fire starting or spreading inside the tank would sometimes cause the crew to abandon the tank. There were several recorded instances where white phosphorus shells defeated German tanks in this fashion. M4 Shermans arrived with the 105mm M4 howitzer, were employed as a 3-vehicle assault gun platoon under the Tank Battalion Headquarters Company, along with another one in each medium tank company, a total of 6 tanks in the battalion, to provide close fire support and smoke. Armored infantry battalions were also eventually issued 3 of the 105mm Shermans in the Headquarters Company. The 105mm armed variants were issued the M67 High Explosive Anti-Tank, or HEAT, round. Although very effective, the low muzzle velocity made hitting enemy armor difficult. The 105mm Shermans were not equipped with a power-traversing turret, and this resulted in complaints from soldiers in the field. An upgrade was not available before the end of the war. Secondary armament. The standard secondary armament comprised a coaxial 30 caliber M1919 Browning machine gun A5 with 4,750 rounds of ammunition, a ball-mounted M1919A4 in the front hull operated by the assistant driver, and a pintle-mounted 50 caliber M2 Browning HB machine gun with 300 rounds on the turret roof for anti-aircraft protection. Early production models of the M4 and M4A1 also had a pair of fixed, forward-firing M1919 machine guns mounted in the front hull and operated by the driver. This arrangement was inherited from the M2 and M3 medium tanks and was a result of World War I requirement to be able to sweep the ground in front of an advancing tank with unaimed fire. Armor. The turret armor of the 75mm and 105mm armed M4 ranged from 25.4mm to 76.2mm thick. The turret front armor was 76.2mm thick, angled at 30 degrees from the vertical, giving an effective thickness of 87.9mm. The opening in the front of the M4's turret for the main gun was covered by a rounded 50.8mm thick rotor shield. Early Shermans that had a periscopic sight for the main gun mounted in the turret roof possessed a small 76.2mm thick mantlet that only covered the hole where the main gun barrel protruded. The exposed barrel of the coaxial machine gun was vulnerable to bullet splash or shrapnel, and a small armored cover was manufactured to protect it. When the Sherman was later fitted with a telescopic sight next to the main gun, a larger 76.2mm thick gun mantlet that covered the entire rotor shield, including the sight and coaxial machine gun barrel, was produced. 105mm armed Sherman tanks did not have a rotor shield, possessing only the mantlet covered the opening in the turret front. The turret sight armor was 50.8mm thick at a 5-degree angle from the vertical. The turret rear armor was 50.8mm thick and vertical, while the turret roof was 25.4mm thick and flat. Later models of the M4A1, M4A2, and M4A3 Sherman tanks were equipped with the T-80 turret developed for the T-23 tank and the new 76mm gun. This turret's armor was 63.5 millimeters thick on the sides and rear, angled from 0 to 13 degrees from the vertical. It had a 25.4 millimeter thick roof, which sat at 0 to 45 degrees from the vertical. The front of the T-23 turret, which, like the 105 millimeter armed Sherman's turret, did not have a rotor shield, was protected by an unsloped 88.9 millimeter thick cast gun mantlet. Combat experience indicated that the single hatch in the 3-man 75mm gun turret was inadequate for timely evacuation, so Ordnance added a loader's hatch beside the commander's beginning in late 1943. All 76mm gun turrets had 2 roof hatches. The Sherman's glacis plate was originally 50.8 millimeters thick, talking about the hull now, and angled at 56 degrees from the vertical, providing an effective thickness of 90.8 millimeters. The M4, M4A1, and early production M4A2 and early production M4A3 possessed protruding cast hatchway structures that allowed the driver and assistant driver's hatches to fit in front of the turret ring. In these areas, the effect of the glacis plate slope was greatly reduced. Later Shermans had an upgraded glacis plate that was uniformly 63.5 millimeters thick and sloped at 47 degrees from the vertical, providing an effective thickness of 93.1 millimeters over the entire plate. The new design improved overall ballistic protection by eliminating the hatchways, while also allowing for larger hatches for the driver and bow gunner. The cast hull M4A1 for the most part retained its previous glacis shape even after the larger hatches were introduced. The casting, irrespective of the larger hatches, sat 37 to 55 degrees from the vertical, with a large majority of the piece sitting closer to a 55-degree angle. The transmission housing was rounded, made of 3 cast sections bolted together or cast as one piece. It ranged from 50.8 to 108 millimeters thick. The upper and lower hull sides were 38 millimeters thick and vertical, while the upper hull rear was also 38 millimeters thick, vertical, or sloped at 10 degrees from the vertical. The lower hull rear, which protected the engine, was 38 millimeters thick, sloped at 0 to 22 degrees from the vertical depending upon the variant. The hull roof was 25.4 millimeters. The hull floor ranged from 25.4 millimeters thick under the driver and assistant driver's position to 12.7 millimeters thick at the rear. The M4 had a hatch on the hull bottom to dispose of spent shell casings and to provide emergency escape route. In the Pacific, Marines often use this Sherman feature in reverse to recover wounded infantry under fire. Effectiveness. The armor of the Sherman was ineffective against most Axis tanks, such as the tanks like the Panzer IV with 7.5 centimeter cannon and above, along with anti-tank weapon fire early in the war during multiple occasions. So it was decided it needed a compound angle to resist later German tank and anti-tank guns. The distinctive protruding hatchways of the early Sherman comprised the 56-degree angled glacis plate, or compromised the 56-degree angled glacis plate, making them weak points where the effect of the glacis plate slope was greatly reduced. In 1943, to make the thickness of these areas equal with the rest of the glacis plate, 1-inch thick applique armor plates were fitted in front of them. A Waffenamt Proefwesen 1 report estimated that with the M4 angled 30 degrees sideways and the APC-BC round, the Tiger 1's 8.8 centimeter KWK 36 L56 gun would be capable of penetrating the differential case of an American M4 Sherman from 2,100 meters, and the turret from 1,800 meters, but the Tiger's 88mm gun would not penetrate the upper glacis plate at any range, and that the Panther with its long-barreled 7.5 centimeter KWK 42 L70 would have to close in to 100 meters in order to achieve a penetration in the same situation. However, other German documents suggested that the glacis of a Sherman could be penetrated at a range of 800 meters by the Tiger 1. The Tiger 1 was estimated to be able to penetrate the Sherman in most other armor plates at a range of 2 kilometers or above, far exceeding the ranges at which the tank itself was vulnerable to fire from the Sherman. Although the later model German medium and heavy tanks were greatly feared, Buckley opined, the vast majority of German tanks encountered in Normandy were either inferior or merely equal to the Sherman, Panzer III or Panzer IV. Research for tank casualties from Normandy from 6 June to 10 July 1944, conducted by the British No. 2 Operational Research Section, concluded that from a sample of 40 Sherman tanks, 33 tanks burned and 7 tanks remained unburned following an average of 1.89 penetrations. In comparison, from a sample of 5 Panzer IVs, 4 tanks burned and 1 tank remained unburned following an average of 1.5 penetrations. The Panther tank burned 14 times from a sample of 22 tanks and following 3.24 penetrations, while the Tiger burned 4 times out of a sample of 5 tanks following 3.25 penetrations. John Buckley, using a case study of the British 8th and 29th Armored Brigades, found that of their 166 Shermans knocked out in combat during the Normandy campaign, 94 burned out. Buckley also notes that the American survey carried out concluded that 65% of tanks burned out after being penetrated. United States Army research proved that the major reason for this was the stowage of the main gun ammunition in the vulnerable sponsons above the tracks. A U.S. Army study in 1945 concluded that only 10 to 15% of wet stowage Shermans burned when penetrated, compared to 60 to 80% of the older dry stowage Shermans. As a burned tank was unrecoverable, it was prudent in combat to continue to fire at a tank until it caught fire. At first, a partial remedy to ammunition fires in the M4 was found in 1943 by welding 1-inch thick applique armor plates to the sponson sides over the ammunition stowage bins, though there was doubt that these had any effect. Later models moved ammunition stowage to the whole floor, with water jackets surrounding each storage bin. The practice, known as wet stowage, reduced the chance of fire after a hit to about 15%. The Shermans allegedly gained the grim nickname Tommy Cooker by the Germans, who referred to British soldiers as Tommies. A Tommy Cooker was a World War I era trench stove, though no evidence appears to exist beyond anecdote on the Allied side and post-war. Conversely, it was also allegedly called Ronson or Zippo due to the flamethrower version of the tank and not because it lights the first time every time. This nickname story has been almost conclusively proven to be a fabrication, as the Ronson Company did not begin using the slogan until the 1950s, and the average soldier did not have a Ronson lighter. Fuel fires occasionally occurred, but such fires were far less common and less deadly than ammunition fires. In many cases, the fuel tank of the Sherman was found intact after the fire. Tankers described fierce, blinding jets of flame, which is consistent with burning pressurized hydraulic fluid, but not gasoline-related fires. Overview. Comparisons can be drawn between the T-34 and the U.S. M4 Sherman tank. Both tanks were the backbone of the armored units in their respective armies. Both nations distributed these tanks to their allies, who also used them as the mainstay of their own armored formations, and both were upgraded extensively and fitted with more powerful guns. Both were designed for mobility and ease of manufacture and maintenance, sacrificing some performance for these goals. Both chassis were used as the foundation for a variety of support vehicles, such as armor recovery vehicles, tank destroyers, and self-propelled artillery. Both were an approximately even match for the standard German medium tank, the Panzer IV, though each of these 3 tanks had particular advantages and weaknesses compared with the other 2. Neither the T-34 nor the M4 was a match for Germany's heavier tanks. The Panther, technically a medium tank, or the Tiger I. The Soviets used the IS-2 heavy tank, and the U.S. used the M26 Pershing as the heavy tanks of their forces instead. Upgrades. Upgrades included the rectangular armor patches protecting ammunition stowage mentioned above, and similar armor patches in front of each of the protruding hatchway structures in the glacis in an attempt to mitigate their ballistic weakness. Field improvisations included placing sandbags, spare track links, concrete, wire mesh, or even wood for increased protection against shape-charged rounds. While mounting sandbags around a tank had little effect against high-velocity anti-tank fire, it was thought to provide standoff protection against heat weapons, primarily the German Panzerfaust anti-tank grenade launcher and the 88mm caliber Panzerschreck anti-tank rocket launcher. In the only study known to have been done to test the use of sandbags on 9 March 1945, officers of the 1st Armored Group tested a standard Panzerfaust 60s against sandbagged M4s. Shots against the side blew away the sandbags and still penetrated the side armor, whereas shots fired at an angle against the front plate blew away some of the sandbags but failed to penetrate the armor. Earlier in the summer of 1944, General Patton, informed by his ordnance officers that sandbags were useless, and that the machine's chassis suffered from the extra weight, had forbidden the use of sandbags. Following the clamor for better armor and firepower after the losses of the Battle of the Bulge, Patton ordered extra armor plates salvaged from knocked-out American and German tanks welded to the turrets and hulls of tanks of his command. Approximately 36 of this up-armored M4s were supplied to each of the 3 armored divisions of the 3rd Army in the spring of 1945. M4A3E2. The M4A3E2 Sherman Jumbo Assault Tank variant, based upon standard M4A375W hull, had an additional 38mm plate welded to the glacis, giving a total thickness of 102mm, which resulted in a glacis of 149mm line-of-sight thickness and over 180mm effective thickness. The sponson sides had 38mm thick plates welded on to make them 76mm thick. The transmission cover was significantly thicker, and a new, more massive T-23 style turret with 178mm of armor on the sides and rear, and a 25.4mm thick flat roof. The gun mantlet had an additional 89mm of armor welded on, giving a total thickness of 177.8mm. It was originally to be armed with the 76mm gun, but the 75mm was preferred for infantry support and was used, although some were later upgraded to use the 76mm. The higher weight required changing the transmission gear ratios to reduce maximum speed to 22 miles per hour, and crews were warned not to let the suspension bottom too violently. 254 were built at the Fisher Tank Arsenal from May to July 1944 and arrived in Europe in the fall of 1944, being employed throughout the remainder of the fighting in various roles. They were considered highly successful. Mobility. In its initial specifications for a replacement for the M3 medium tank, the U.S. Army restricted Sherman's height, width, and weight so that it could be transported via typical bridges, roads, railroads, and landing craft without special accommodation. Army Regulation 850-15 initially restricted the width of a tank to 103 inches and its weight to 30 tons. This greatly aided the strategic, logistical, and tactical flexibility and mobility of all Allied armored forces using the Sherman. A long-distance service trial conducted in Britain in 1943 compared diesel and gasoline Shermans to Cromwell tanks and Centaur. The British officer commanding the trial concluded, quote, "They are utterly reliable. I do not think they are quite as good as the Cromwell across the country when they are running on rather worn rubber tracks and the going is greasy. Neither does one get as smooth a ride, but they appear so infinitely superior in every other way, particularly in reliability with a minimum of maintenance, that this cross-country consideration is completely overweighed," unquote. The Sherman had good speed both on and off-road. Off-road performance varied. In the desert, the Sherman's rubber block tracks performed well, and in the confined hilly terrain of Italy, the smaller, nimbler Sherman could often cross terrain that some heavy German tanks could not. Albert Speer recounted in his autobiography, Inside the Third Reich, "On the southwestern front, Italy reports on the cross-country mobility of the Sherman have been very favorable. The Sherman climbs mountains our tank experts consider inaccessible to tanks. One great advantage is that the Sherman has a very powerful motor in proportion to its weight. Its cross-country mobility on level ground is, as the 26th Panzer Division reports, definitely superior to that of our tanks." However, while this may have held compared with the first-generation German tanks such as the Panzer III and Panzer IV, comparative testing with the second-generation wide-track German tanks, Panther and Tiger, conducted by the Germans at their Kummersdorf testing facility, as well as by the U.S. 2nd Armored Division, proved otherwise. The M4's initial tracks were 16.5 inches wide. This produced ground pressure of 14 pounds per square inch. U.S. crews found that on soft ground, the narrow tracks of the Sherman gave poorer ground pressure compared to the Panther and Tiger. Because of their wider tracks and use of the characteristic Schachtelaufwerk, interleaved and overlapped road wheels, as used on pre-war origin German half-track vehicles, the Panther and Tiger had greater mobility on soft ground because of their greater flotation, i.e. lower ground pressure. Lieutenant Colonel Wilson M. Hawkins of the 2nd Armored Division wrote the following comparing the U.S. M4 Sherman and the German Panther in a report to Allied headquarters. Quote, "It has been claimed that our tank is more maneuverable. In recent tests, we put a captured German Mark V Panther against all models of our own. The German tank was the faster, both the cross-country and on the highway, and could make sharper turns. It was also the better hill climber, unquote. This was backed up in an interview with Technical Sergeant Willard D. May of the 2nd Armored Division, who commented, quote, I have taken instructions on the Mark V Panther and have found, first, it is easily as maneuverable as the Sherman, second, the flotation exceeds that of the Sherman, unquote. Staff Sergeant and Tank Platoon Sergeant Charles A. Carden completes the comparison in his report, quote, the Mark V Panther and 6 Tiger, in my opinion, have more maneuverability and certainly more flotation. I've seen it in many cases where the Mark V and 6 tanks could maneuver nicely over ground where the M4 would bog down. On one occasion, I saw at least 10 Royal Tigers make a counterattack against us over ground that for us was nearly impassable, unquote. The U.S. Army issued extended and connectors, duckbills, to add width to the standard tracks as a stopgap solution. Duckbills began to reach frontline tank battalions in fall 1944, but were original factory equipment for the heavy M4A3E2 Jumbo to compensate for the extra weight of armor. The M4A376W HVSS Shermans and other late models with wider tracked suspensions corrected these problems, but formed only a small proportion of the tanks in service even in 1945. Reliability. M4A1. In September 1942, the British developed some potential improvements and tested the tanks. After 805 kilometers, the springs of the left front bogie broke, considered typical for this type of suspension. Oil accumulated on the floor of the engine compartment during driving. The engine periodically stalled under high load due to interrupted fuel supply. It was found that the engine had been built and installed incorrectly. Upon disassembly, carbon deposits were found on the working surfaces of the cylinders. They were very worn out after only 65 hours of operation or 702 miles run. In the absence of a replacement by 10 October, the engine was put back in the tank. The revised fuel system was supposed to improve the stalling engine. In November 1943, several M4A1 Shermans were tested at the American Proving Ground to test British innovations. On one of them, 37 experimental changes were made, on the second, 47, on the third, 53. In total, 60 changes were developed and implemented for the Shermans, most of which were considered successful after a 600-mile run and firing. M4A2. In Africa, the British engines ran for 700 to 900 miles, or 180 to 200 hours. The engine had to be inspected and repaired after 100 hours, which significantly extended its service life, but there was not enough time for such work, and among crews, it was believed that there was little benefit in the procedure. The engine left much to be desired, as evidenced by attempts at modifications in the 8th Army, which did not affect the reliability of the tank. The Shermans also had other defects, including broken wiring, breaking ignition coils, and clutch rods. The improved roller return design performed much better than that which the early Sherman production inherited from the M3. A February 1943 report described a unit where there were no broken bogie coil springs even after a 1,000-mile march. The tracks, however, suffered. The rubber flaked off, and after a run of 600 miles, the tracks were unusable. Some units rode on tracks without the rubber pads, but the rubber tires of the rollers wore down faster. The introduction of radially grooved tires helped to cope with the overheating when driving fast in the desert, but delamination of the tires still led to cracks in the rollers after 300 miles. The M4A2 performed very well in hot climates in general. The British sent as many of these as possible to the Mediterranean theater, retaining a minimum of vehicles for training in the UK. Complaints began to come in about carbon fouling of the injectors due to oil getting into the combustion chamber. Other mechanical problems were rare and were most common in the left engine. Sherman suffered from wear to tire track pads, which were mitigated by changing to all-metal tracks and ventilated rollers. The tanks proved to be very reliable with proper operation. In June 1943, it was noted that the average service life was estimated at 1,500 miles. The M4A2 was rated very high, while the M4A1 was rated high. The Soviet 6th Guards Army Tank Army determined the lifespan of their M4A2 Shermans to be 2,000 to 2,500 kilometers, or 250 to 300 hours, comparable to the T-34. M4A3. The Ford V8-engined M4A3s took part in the 1943 survival race. On average, the engines worked for 255 hours, the one failed after 87 hours of running. 3 tanks were taken out of the test at 187, 247, and 295 operating hours due to reasons unrelated to the engine. The report noted that even disqualified motors could be returned to service by replacing only one part. The rest were still in excellent condition. Of all the Ford engines, it turned out to be the most service-friendly. The M4A3 tanks covered a greater distance than other Shermans. 10 vehicles covered 20,346 miles in total, half on the road, half off-road, over 2,388 hours, an impressive achievement. The M4A3 continued to lead to reliability through further testing. On tests in the winter and spring of 1944, one tank covered 2,097 miles in 203 hours and 25 minutes. An M4 failed after only 15 hours and 10 minutes and was replaced by another. The M4A1 lasted 27 hours and 15 minutes, and the M4A4 covered 1,343 miles in 149 hours and 35 minutes. Around the same time, another reliability test began, albeit on a smaller scale, of 20 Shermans of various types, including 4 M4A3s. The time spent on repairs was carefully measured. On average, the M4A3 took 110 hours to service the engine, which was better than the M4A1, 132 hours, or M4A2, 143 hours, but more than double the average of 45 hours on maintenance of the Chrysler Multibank by M4A4 crews. The M4A3 remained superior in transmission time, 112 hours versus 340 hours for the M4A4. In terms of suspension, the tanks turned out to be approximately equal. None of the tanks with Ford engines passed the entire route. They dropped out after 293, 302, 347, and 350 hours of running. Only 3 Chrysler engines and 1 General Motors diesel engine coped with the task. Although M4A3s were not in service with other armies, some were supplied to the Allies for review. In early January 1943, a new M4A3 was provided to the British Fighting Vehicle Proving Establishment. By 16 January, it began trials. The engine failed after 495 miles. A new engine was delivered by the end of February. This gave more power and better performance, and despite multiple problems, the tank achieved 2,000 miles. The British considered the M4A3 a very reliable tank, but far from perfect. An upgraded vehicle was tested in the spring of 1944. It covered over 3,000 miles through several defects accumulated over the course of the run. The M4A3 was considered an outstanding vehicle for its reliability. M4A4. In October 1942, 5 M3A4s and 5 M4A4s were tested in the California desert, which was a monstrous test for vehicles with an unsatisfactory cooling system. Constant breakdowns of auxiliary engine units put an end to the tank's combat career in the U.S. Army. By the spring of 1943, the recommendations given by the Armored Council had been implemented, and 10 M4A4 tanks had been driven to a 4,000 miles range. The average service life of the A57 engine reached 240 hours. M4A4 tanks took second place in reliability after the M4A3, with a Ford GAA engine, 255 hours, ahead of diesel M4A2, 225 hours, and M4A1 radial, 218 hours. The M4A4 was the easiest to maintain. Additional tests of 4 M4A4s from 8 October 1943 to 14 February 1944 showed even better results. One engine broke down after 339 hours. 3 others worked 400 hours with less than 10% power loss. 3 out of 4 M4A4 could finish the Armored Council test and drive for 4,000 miles. Despite the positive outcomes of additional testing, oil and fuel consumption was still too high for the engine to be recommended for service in the American Army. Production of the M4A4 was discontinued on 10 October 1943 and was declared obsolete in 1945. Engine. The M4 Sherman used 4 different engines, each of a very different type. Diesel M4A2s had a significant superiority over the R975 gasoline engines. The first M4A3 tank with a Ford GAA V8 gasoline engine, surpassing the R975 in all aspects, was assembled in May 1942, and even the M4A4 had a more reliable engine. The R975 engine began to lose relevance once the vehicle was put into service. The R975 was initially powered by high-octane aviation gasoline. With the entry of the United States into the war, it was necessary to change to a lower-grade fuel. To maintain performance, the maximum octane number of the fuel for the new engine was limited to 80. In April 1942, an engine with a compression ratio of 5.7 was tested, which was considered acceptable. The nominal revs increased from 1,200 to 1,800 per minute. The new engine used a richer fuel mixture and had a larger combustion chamber. Engines were compared in large-scale tests at the Aberdeen Proving Grounds in the winter of 1943 and 1944, with 4 examples each of M4A1, M4A2, M4A3, and M4A4. The endpoint was 4,000 miles or 400 hours runtime. Faults with anything except the motor were repaired and testing resumed. Only critical damage or loss of a third of its original power took the engine out of the competition. During the test, it took 132 hours to service the R975 in the M4A1, 143 hours for the GM diesel M4A2, 110 hours for the Ford GAA M4A3, and 45 hours for the multi-bank M4A4. None of the R975 engines reached the 200 hours mark, failing on average after 166 hours. It was noted that a lot of time was spent on servicing the air filters for the R975 over 23 days of testing. 446 man-hours were spent on cleaning and repairing them. An M4 with the R975 C1 engine was tested a year later over a 5,000-mile test in which the engine had to be replaced 3 times. In addition, there were transmission and suspension problems. The filters performed poorly. It was noted that sand and dust severely spoiled the engine and other units. Work to improve the reliability of the R975 engine led to quite significant changes, resulting in the R975 C4 engine power increased from 432 to 493 horsepower, and fuel consumption decreased by 10%. The engine torque went from 1,800 Nm at 1900 PM to 2040 Nm. Older engines were upgraded to the later model during a major overhaul. The new engine was approved for production on 17 June 1943 with 200 units ordered for the gun-motor carriage T-70 tank destroyer. In October 1943, the British demanded that it be provided for their Shermans. Tests in February 1944 on the M4A1 tank that as well as increased power, oil consumption dropped by 35%, and cylinder temperature by 50 degrees Celsius. The speed increased. The M4A1 with the new engine covered 1.5 miles of paved track in 4 minutes and 45 seconds, 47 seconds faster than the tank with the R975 C1 engine. Tests have also shown increased reliability. The 3 new R975 C4s installed in the M4A1 were withdrawn from testing after 177, 219, and 231 hours respectively, and the R975 C1 upgraded to the C4 standard worked 222 hours on the M4 tank. Compared to its predecessor, the service life of the engines has increased, albeit only slightly. In 1943, the Americans conducted large-scale trials of all types of Shermans. In total, 40 tanks were admitted to them, 10 each, M4A1, M4A2, M4A3, and M4A4. The target was 400 hours or 4,000 miles before the engine failed. The rest of the tank units could be repaired an unlimited number of times. By 23 April 1943, 10 M4A2 had covered a total of 16,215 miles, operating for 1,825 hours. Fuel consumption of the M4A2 was lower than that of other Shermans, 1.1 miles per gallon on the highway and 0.5 miles per gallon on off-road. On average, tanks consumed 0.81 quarts of oil per engine hour. The tests ended on 11 May. By that time, the M4A2 had covered 22,126 miles, running 2,424 hours. The average speed of the M4A2 was the fastest at 9.5 miles per hour. The M4A1 and M4A4 both made 8 miles per hour, while the M4A3 made 9.25 miles per hour. In terms of reliability, the M4A2 was in third place. The first engine failed after 75 hours of operation. 2 engines worked all 400 hours, while one was in good condition and the other was on its last legs. On average, the engines worked for 225 hours before the breakdown of the internal units. Only the R975 engines showed themselves worse than the GM 671. Ford GAA and Chrysler A57 proved to be more reliable. In terms of time spent on maintenance, the M4A2 came in second. The tanks continued to race for survival. At the end of 1943, 20 vehicles entered trials at once. 4 M4A1, M4A2, M4A3, M4A4, and new M4E1 with an experimental engine. The Shermans drove on 3 types of surfaces: fine loose sand, clayey stony ground, and highways. As in previous tests, during the run, the repairman could change any units, and only the breakdown of internal components and engine parts disqualified the tank. By 27 December, all M4A1s, average mileage of 166 hours, and one M4A3 were out of order, but not a single tank with a diesel engine. By 18 February, tests for the M4A2 ended. 3 tanks failed after 276, 278, and 353 hours, respectively, while one covered 4,295 miles in 403 hours and was still on the move. From M4A3, one tank also remained on the move, but with a rather modest mileage since it had been under repair for a long time. Of the 4 M4A4s, one tank broke down, and the M4E1 was removed from testing. It was decided that the RD1820 engine would not go into a large series anyways. By 18 March, the tanks had finished testing. The M4A4 turned out to be the most reliable again. Out of 4 tanks, 3 reached the finish line. The M4A4 engine also took the least time to service, 45 hours per tank. M4A2 was in second place, as the last M4A3 still broke down and did not cover the required distance. However, the maintenance of the GM671 engine took 143 hours, more than the M4A3 or M4A1. The M4A2 also did not shine in servicing the transmission group. It took 220 hours to take care of each tank. In terms of suspension service time, the tank was at the level of other Shermans, 205 hours. A total of 327 hours of a run of the average diesel Sherman took 594.5 hours of mechanics work. U.S. variants. Vehicles that use the chassis or hull derived from M4. M10 tank destroyer, also known as 3-inch gun motor carriage M10. 90mm gun motor carriage M36, also known as Jackson. 105mm howitzer motor carriage M7B1, also known as Priest. 155mm gun motor carriage M12, self-propelled gun, paired in service with the cargo carrier M30. 155mm gun motor carriage M40. 155mm self-propelled artillery. Other artillery vehicles that share this same chassis include 8-inch HMC M43, 250mm MMC T94, and cargo carrier T30. Flame tank Sherman. M4A2 with bow-mounted E4-5 flamethrower. POA CWS H1H2 U.S. Army M4A3R5 USMC Mark 1. CWS in-theater modifications. POA CWS H5 U.S. Army M4A3R8 USMC with coaxial H1A H5A flamethrower. M4-2B1E9, Rocket Artillery Sherman, T-34 Calliope, T-40 Whizbang, and other Sherman rocket launchers. Engineer tanks, D8, M1, and M1A1 dozers, M4 Doosit, Mobile Assault Bridge, and T-1E3 Aunt Jemima mine roller and other mine clearers. Armored Recovery Vehicle, M32 Tank Recovery Vehicle, and M74 Tank Recovery Vehicle. Artillery tractors, M34 and M35 prime movers. Foreign variants in use. The Sherman was used extensively supplied through Lend-Lease to Britain, Soviet Union, China, and Free France. Britain received 17,181 in various models, mostly M4A2s and M4A4s. 5,041 Sherman 3 and 7,167 5, respectively, of which over 2,000 were re-equipped with a more powerful gun to become the Sherman Firefly. The Soviet Union was shipped 4,065 M4, M4A2s 1,990 with 75mm and 2,073 with 76mm armed versions, 2 M4A4s. Or 4,102 M4, 2007 with 75mm and 2,095 with 76mm versions. Enrolled 3,664. The Free French were the third largest recipient, being given 755 during 1943 and 1944. At least 57 or 157 Shermans were also delivered to other U.S. allies. A similar vehicle was developed in Canada from January 1941, known as the Ram tank. Like the Sherman, this was based on the M3 Lee's chassis and powertrain upgraded to have a turret, although it used a new turret of Canadian design. One improvement was the use of all-steel CDP tracks, which, although an inch narrower than the earlier M4 steel and rubber pad tracks, were cheaper to produce and gave better traction. Suspension units and road wheels remained the M3 vertical volute pattern, with the idler above the mounting brackets, rather than the M4 development with the idler moved behind the mounting bracket to give more room for suspension travel. The Ram had a distinctive turret with a bolted flat-faced mantlet and the UK 6-pounder gun, with a Hull machine gunner housed in a rotating turret based on the M3 Lee cupola, rather than the simpler ball mount that was becoming universal for tank hull guns. Production facilities for the Ram were constructed at the Montreal Locomotive Works, with the aid of Alco, but the larger armor casings for turret and hull were supplied by General Steel castings in the U.S. Greater Sherman production availability meant that the Ram was never used in action as a gun tank, being either used for training or converted to Kangaroo armored personnel carriers. A later Canadian medium tank produced in late 1943 was the Grizzly, an adaptation of the Sherman M4A1. This differed only in details, such as CDP tracks, British radio equipment, and the British 2-inch smoke mortar in the turret roof. 188 were produced. After World War II, Shermans were supplied to some NATO armies. Shermans were used by the U.S. and Allied forces in the Korean War. After World War II, Shermans were supplied to some. After World War II, quite a few Shermans also went to Israel. The Israeli Ordnance Corps, seeking an upgrade it using the 75mm CN 7550 L/61.5 from the French AMX 13/75 light tank, and the 105mm Model F1 from the French AMX 30 main battle tank, designated the M50 and M51 respectively. These Super Shermans, as they were often called, were remarkable examples of how a long obsolete design can be upgraded for frontline use. They saw combat in the 1967 Six-Day War, fighting Soviet World War II era armor like the T-34-85, and also in the 1973 Yom Kippur War. The M50 and M51 Super Shermans were eventually retired from Israel in 1980 and were replaced by the much more modern Merkava platform. Paraguay retired 3 Shermans from the Regimiento Escolta Presidencial, REP, or Presidential Escort Regiment, in 2018, which marked the end of service of the final Sherman tanks in use anywhere in the world. Former operators: Argentina, Australia for testing purposes only. Belgium, M4A3E4 Sherman was used. Brazil, 80 M4, M4A1 Shermans received. Canada, Chile, People's Republic of China, obtained through Lend-Lease. Cuba, Denmark, M4A3E4 Sherman supplied by the U.S. Egypt, used during the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, later received Sherman 3s M4A2 from Britain and some Shermans fitted with FL-10 turrets from France. Ethiopia, France, 755, Free France. Greece, India, Iran, Israel, Italy from post-World War II. Indonesia, inherited from the Netherlands following independence in 1949. Japan, from post-World War II, M4A3E8 Sherman supplied by the U.S. South Korea, 20 M4A3E8, 388 M4A3E8 for the Army, retired in 1971, replaced by the M48 Patton. Lebanon, Mexico, Nazi Germany as Beutpanzer captured vehicles. Netherlands, the Royal Netherlands Army received 44 Sherman tanks in January 1952. New Zealand, Nicaragua, M4A3-105. Pakistan received Mark III and Mark V at independence in 1947 and later received M4A1E6 Shermans from the U.S. in 1950s. Paraguay, retired in April 2018. Peru, Philippines, Poland, Portugal, M4A3E4 Shermans used. South Africa, Soviet Union, 3,664. Sweden, for testing purposes only. Syria, 1 turretless M4A1 Sherman. Uganda. Turkey, 34 delivered in January 1945. United Kingdom, 17,181. United States, original operator, retired in 1957. Yugoslavia, 599 M4A3E4 Shermans received during the Informbiro period. See also SCR 508, list of land vehicles of the U.S. Armed Forces, list of named tanks, Allied technological cooperation during World War II. G numbers: M50 Super Sherman, Rhino tank. Tanks of comparable role, performance, and era: Argentine Nahuel DL-43, Australian Sentinel, Australian Thunderbolt, British Cromwell, British Comet, comparable to the EZ-8 variant. Canadian Grizzly 1, German Panzer III with 7.5 centimeter gun. German Panzer IV, German Panther, comparable to the EZ-8 and Jumbo variants. Hungarian Turan III, Italian Carro Armato P40, Italian P43 proposal. Japanese Type 3 Chi-Nu, Romanian 1942 medium tank proposal. Soviet T-34, T-34-85 variant comparable to the EZ-8 variant. Swedish Stridsvagn M/42. All right, there we go. The famous M4 Sherman. Let me know what you think. Drop your comments down below, and as always, let me know what you'd like to hear next. Thanks for watching, and we'll talk to you next time.